But right now it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. He is the author of 12 books, including the highly acclaimed biographies of Chief Justice John Marshall, General Lucius D. Clay, Ulysses S. Grant, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR won the Francis Parkman Prize from the Society of American Historians. And most recently, Eisenhower in War and Peace, published by Random House just this past year, 2012. The Ulysses S. Grant book was a 2002 Pulitzer Prize finalist. A graduate of Princeton and Columbia Universities, Professor Smith here has taught at the University of Toronto for 35 years before joining the faculty at Marshall University, where he is the John Marshall Professor of Political Science. He is currently visiting professor at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Gene Edward Smith.
Thank you very much, and let me come clean. This will not be a slideshow. Paul was good enough to find a picture of Grant that I could use in the beginning. I've never really done slideshows before. I recall when I was an undergraduate at Princeton back in the early 1950s, we had a course, Art and Architecture 101, which all of us took during our junior year. That would have been 1952, in which it was taught by a distinguished art historian, in which he always had slides of the paintings and the buildings that he was going to be discussing. We called it Darkness at Noon. It's a pleasure to talk today to the Conference on the Great Captains of American History and to talk about Grant. Let me begin, though, with a word of caution, particularly here in this environment in which we are. War is a terrible thing, and it really ought not be romanticized. And one can't talk about these great military commanders out of context. This is about military conflict, and it's always a great tragedy for everyone involved. Tomorrow you will be looking at Eisenhower, and David will speak on Ike. Having written about both, let me suggest certain parallels between Ike and Grant. They were both professional soldiers, both educated at West Point, commanded victorious armies of unprecedented magnitude, were elected president and re-elected again with overwhelming majorities, and left office at the height of their popularity. They also suffered significant erosions in their reputations in the years following, and I think are both now experiencing renewed appreciation. In Grant's case, his fall from grace traces to the return of white supremacy after Reconstruction. Frederick Douglass once said, "Grant was the last of the radicals," and he genuinely believed in equality for African Americans. So long as Grant was president, the United States Army remained in the South, and the rights of the former slaves were protected. But for the next 3 generations here, that view of racial equality was rejected. We lived in a world of segregation, separate but equal, and Grant's reputation suffered accordingly. Grant's generalship was also disparaged. Robert E. Lee became the hero for lost cause historians. The fact that Lee never won a battle after Grant came east in early 1864 is rarely mentioned. With Ike, it was much the same. Eisenhower always made everything he did look easy. After he made peace in Korea in 1953, not one American died in combat for the next 8 years. Eisenhower twice resisted calls from the National Security Council and Joint Chiefs to use nuclear weapons, once to relieve the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu, and again during the Formosa Straits crisis, and when Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to seize the Suez Canal 1 week before the election in 1956, Eisenhower forced them to withdraw. I think the point is that both Grant and Eisenhower had seen war at its most extreme, and both were determined to prevent it from recurring. In Grant's case, this involved the total destruction of the Confederate Army. After Grant left the presidency in 1876, he undertook a 2-year tour of the world. Everywhere Grant went, he was received by royalty and enormous crowds. He spent 2 weeks in Berlin and got along famously with Chancellor Bismarck. One afternoon over coffee, Bismarck commiserated with Grant about the Civil War, about the fact that it was so long, brother against brother. Grant corrected him. Grant said it had to be long, and the South had to be totally defeated, otherwise the United States could never have eliminated slavery. There's a parallel to Eisenhower as well. Many military historians argue that after the fall of Paris in the summer of 1944, the Allies could have driven straight to Berlin with a single thrust, and that the Germans could not have stopped them. That the broad front strategy that Eisenhower followed added another 6 or 8 months to the war. Now that, of course, is hindsight and no one will ever know, but even conceding it's correct, let me suggest that those additional 6 or 8 months of the war, even with all of this, particularly with all of the suffering and destruction and loss of life that it entailed, made it absolutely clear to the Germans that the Nazis had lost the war. Like Grant's total victory in the Civil War, Ike's victory in World War II made it possible for a new Germany to join the family of nations with absolutely no longing for the Nazi period. Both Grant and Eisenhower hated war, much to the consternation, when Grant became president, much to the consternation of Sherman and Sheridan. Grant made peace with the Indians on the Great Plains, resolved long-standing differences with Great Britain, twice resisted pressure to go to war with Spain over Cuba. In Eisenhower's case, he totally dismissed the idea of limited war, which he thought was a contradiction in terms. Under Eisenhower, the United States would not go to war unless national survival was at stake, and if it did, it would do so with nuclear weapons. And under Eisenhower, that kept the peace for the next 8 years. Now, you may be wondering, why do scholars write books on particular people? In my own case, and with Grant, it has to do with my family heritage. My ancestors settled in Mississippi in the 1820s, remain there. I first encountered General Grant when I was about 10 years old. My father took me and my young cousins up to the battlefield at Shiloh. And like young boys are wont to do, we looked around and said, well, if Albert Sidney Johnston had done this or if Beauregard had done that, the South could have won. My father looked at us for a while, and then he said, you boys better hush up. General Grant was in command of the Union Army that day, and General Grant never lost a battle. And we should be damn glad that he didn't. My father said that, knowing that his grandfather, my great-grandfather, died at Shiloh for the Confederacy. But I've been hooked on Grant ever since. When we look back at General Grant, it seems clear to me that more than any other figure except Lincoln, Grant was responsible for saving the Union. The Civil War was not a war between the states. much less sovereign nations. It was a rebellion. And President Lincoln, under his authority to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, was simply suppressing the rebellion against national authority in the southern states, which remained part of the Union. Often in lectures previously on Grant, I've talked about the Civil War as a war of treason, slavery, racism, and rebellion. I gave that speech one time down at Shiloh, much to the consternation of the National Park Service people at Shiloh. And to pay me back for that, Grant is the only biography of Grant. My Grant is the only biography of Grant they don't carry in the bookstore. Looking at the war itself, no two men better personified the causes for which they fought than Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee. Lee, charismatically handsome, the son of Light Horse Harry Lee, and Ann Carter of Tidewater, exemplified the romantic virtues of the South's slaveholding aristocracy. Grant, the son of an Ohio tanner, indistinguishable in a crowd, even in uniform, personified the values of a modernizing democratic society. Both men were superb general officers who had the complete loyalty of the armies they commanded. Lee's military career had been exemplary. Grant's past was spotty. He knew failure in hard times and what it meant to live at the bottom of the economic ladder. Lee stood for a way of life that was ending. Grant for the new era of industrial democracy that was beginning. Lee represented America's past. Grant represented its future. And Grant really was the most unlikely of military heroes. A great general who disliked West Point and rejected the peacetime army. Grant wrote in his memoirs, "If I could have escaped West Point without bringing myself into disgrace at home, I would have done so. A military life had no charms for me, and I had not the faintest idea of staying in the Army, even if I should be graduated, which I did not expect." Grant finished in the middle of his class, 21st out of 39. Spent much of his time at West Point reading fiction and really learning painting in the studio of Robert Weir, a prominent Hudson Valley artist at the time who taught drawing at the Academy. Another one of Weir's students, several years before Grant, was James Greenleaf Whittier. Whittier failed out of the Academy in chemistry. Later, Whittier said, "If silicon had been a gas, I would have been a major general." Grant also excelled in horsemanship at the Academy, set a record jumping that remained an Academy record for the next 25 years. If Grant had had his way, he would have become a professor of mathematics, but that didn't happen. His first duty station was with the 4th Infantry at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, and it was there that he met his wife, Julia, who happened to be a cousin of his classmate, Longstreet. Then came the Mexican War. Grant served first under General Zachary Taylor, old rough and ready, whom Grant admired, and really on whom Grant patterned himself. He then served under General Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers, and it was from Scott that Grant also learned a great deal. Most of Grant's time in the Mexican War was spent as quartermaster of the 4th Infantry, and he learned from Scott that an army can live off the land. Scott broke away from his base at Veracruz to march on and capture Mexico City, living off the Mexican land. Grant did the same before Vicksburg, when he cut his supply line to Memphis, moved south of Vicksburg, crossed the Mississippi below Vicksburg, and then attacked the city from the east, living on the land just as Scott had done. Grant developed an abiding affection for Mexico and the Mexican people. He thought the American cause was unjust, and in his writings about it continuously condemned war as the most unsavory exercise of mankind. I might say, insofar as Grant's affection for the Mexican people, in the summer of 1865, after the surrender, this was a time when the Mexican natives under Juarez were fighting the regime of Maximilian, Emperor Maximilian, the French and the French government. Grant, on his own authority as General-in-Chief, told Sheridan to arm the Juarez fighters. And you can imagine that the Union Army had a lot of excess arms to supply in the summer of 1865. After the war, Grant served in a series of frontier postings, first at Sackett's Harbor on Lake Ontario, and then at Fort Humboldt on the Pacific coast. It was at Fort Humboldt that Grant grew morose, longed for Julia and his children who had not come out with him. They were back east, and began to drink heavily. One day he was found inebriated at pay call. His commanding officer, Colonel Buchanan, gave him the option of standing a court-martial or resigning, and Grant resigned instantly, not wanting his family to know of the incident. That was April 11th, 1854. I might add that Grant never held that against Buchanan. When Grant came east as General-in-Chief in 1864, Buchanan was commanding the Brigade of Regulars, as he had since the war began. Grant immediately promoted him to Major General, and then after the war made him military governor of Louisiana. The next 7 years after Grant resigned in 54 were difficult. He tried and failed, first as a farmer, then as a real estate salesman, then a rent collector, and then a businessman. Failed at each. Poverty stared him in the face. At Christmas time in 1857, he pawned his gold watch to buy presents for his family. Later, he was reduced to selling firewood on a street corner in St. Louis, wearing his old Army overcoat. When Beauregard fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, Grant was working as a clerk in a leather goods store run by his two younger brothers in Galena, Illinois. He immediately volunteered, but was denied a place in the regular army. He was commissioned a colonel in the Illinois militia by the governor and led his newly formed Illinois regiment to attack the Confederate forces assembling across the Mississippi and Missouri. My sensations as we approached what I suppose would be a field of battle were anything but agreeable, Grant wrote. I had been in all the engagements of the Mexican War, but not in command. As we approached the brow of the hill from which it was expected we would see the enemy, my heart kept getting higher and higher until I felt it as though it was in my throat. I would have given anything to be back in Illinois, but I had not the moral courage to halt and consider what to do. When we reached the point at the top of the hill from which the valley below was in full view, I halted. The place where the Confederates had been in camp was still there, but the troops were gone. It occurred to me that Colonel Harris, the Confederate commander, had been as much afraid of me as I was of him. This view of the question I had never taken before, but it was one I never forgot afterwards. Thanks to Congressman Elihu Washburn, who represented Galena, Grant was promoted to brigadier general and given command of the Union forces on the upper Mississippi. He moved south and in February 1862 captured Fort Donelson. The capture of Fort Donelson was the first significant Union victory in the war. Grant was promoted to major general. Grant demanded unconditional surrender at Donelson, and this was a pattern that he continued. 2 months later, Grant was surprised on a Sunday morning at Shiloh by Albert Sidney Johnson, but he held the line that day, was reinforced that night, attacked the next day, and won the battle, the bloodiest war of the Civil War up to that point. After the battle, a group of congressmen called on President Lincoln, demanded that Grant be relieved because they heard he was drinking. Grant was amused at the congressmen, bandied with them for a while, and then asked them if they knew what brand of liquor Grant was drinking. They had a hurried conference among themselves and agreed they didn't know, and Grant and Lincoln said, "Oh, well, I wish you could find out so that I could send a case to my other generals." Fact is, Grant was not drinking at Shiloh. An interesting contrast to General Lee. When the war began, Lee was given 2 bottles of liquor that he put in his kit. When the war was over, the 2 bottles were still in his kit, never been opened. It took Grant a year to capture Vicksburg and to open the Mississippi to shipping, splitting the Confederacy in 2. As I mentioned, Grant cut himself off from his supply line at Memphis and crossed the Mississippi below Vicksburg and attacked the city from the east. Grant undertook this all on his own initiative. He did not tell Washington what he was doing. Throughout the war, Grant made sweeping decisions on his own authority and was always prepared to be relieved if he should be wrong. At Vicksburg, again, it was unconditional surrender, although this time Grant paroled the Confederate soldiers rather than taking them prisoners. Grant hated vindictiveness, and I think because he had known such humiliation during that period from 54 to 61, he was reluctant to inflict it on others. After Vicksburg came Chattanooga, and Grant for the first time commanded troops from 3 armies, from the Army of the Tennessee, from the Army of the Cumberland under George Thomas, and Hooker's Corps from the Army of the Potomac. In February 1864, Grant was promoted to lieutenant general by act of Congress, the first person to hold that rank since George Washington. Grant was ordered east to take command of all Union armies as general-in-chief. When Grant arrived in Washington in early 1864, he made 3 unexpected decisions. First, he decided that he would command all Union armies as general-in-chief from the field, not from an office in Washington, and the invention of the telegraph, the use of the telegraph, made it possible to do that. Secondly, he retained General Henry Halleck as chief of staff in Washington. Old brains would handle the paperwork and the politics, leaving Grant free to be in the field. And third, the other surprise was that he retained General Meade in command of the Army of the Potomac. Meade had thought he would be relieved, and he made Sherman the commander of the Army of the Tennessee. But Grant, as general-in-chief, went to the field, and on May 4th, 1864, he crossed the Rapidan River in Virginia with Meade's army, to find Lee and attack him. And actually, it was Lee who attacked Grant almost immediately in the Wilderness. The fighting was some of the heaviest of the war. And after 3 days, Grant gave another order, this time to move south. This is one of the most famous incidents in the Civil War. Previous Union commanders had always moved back following Lee's attack. And when Grant said move south, this was the beginning of the end of the Confederacy. Grant's campaign in Northern Virginia is one of the classics of modern war. Grant was not interested in capturing territory or occupying Richmond, but in destroying the Confederate Army. Lee's army will be your objective point, he told Meade. Where Lee goes, there you will go also. Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor, followed in quick succession. After the terrible bloodletting at Cold Harbor, Grant broke off again, crossed the James River, and unknown to Lee, moved against Petersburg below Richmond. It was a maneuver similar to what he had performed at Vicksburg. The campaign in Northern Virginia was costly. Grant lost 53,000 men. His casualty ratio compared to Lee's was 5-3. He lost 5 men for every 3 men Lee lost. Grant could replenish his losses. Lee could not. The continued pressure that Grant imposed gave the Confederates no respite, and the shortage of feed and fuel, and fodder, and the loss of equipment were taking their toll. At Grant's order, Sheridan laid waste to the Shenandoah Valley, burning crops in the field, as Sherman did on his march to the sea and in South Carolina. Grant's order to Sheridan, colorfully by the way, said to destroy the crops in the fields and in the barns in the Shenandoah. If a crow flies over the Shenandoah Valley, Grant told Sheridan it should have to take its own food with him. In all of this, Grant really represented the calm at the center of the storm. He accepted the reality of war and recognized that victory could not be achieved without fighting. And he never lost sight of his ultimate goal of the restoration of peace. As Grant saw it, the shortest road to peace led through the wilderness and Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, and the total defeat of the Confederate Army. Said differently, Grant wanted the war to end as quickly as possible, and this meant grinding Lee down through continuous assault. At Appomattox, Grant took the surrender of another Confederate army for the third and final time. Once again, the terms were unconditional surrender. As at Vicksburg, the men were paroled and sent home. This time they were allowed to keep their horses for the spring plowing. Now, Grant, acting under his own authority as General-in-Chief as he wrote out the surrender document, concluded with a sentence that took a massive step toward bringing the Union together. The officers and men who turned in their weapons and returned home were, in Grant's words, not to be disturbed by United States authority so long as they observed their paroles and the laws enforced where they reside. With those words, Grant pardoned the Army of Northern Virginia for treason, and he undercut the vengeance that was festering in Union circles to hang the Confederate leaders. In the bitter days of reprisal following Lincoln's assassination, it was Grant's words alone that really stood between Lee and the gallows. You may not be aware of it, but a federal grand jury in Norfolk indicted Lee and Johnston and Longstreet for treason. Lee wrote to Grant asking if that was consistent with the terms of surrender. Grant told President Johnson that it was not, that the indictments would have to be dropped. President Johnson asked Grant, well, when can Lee be tried? And Grant said never. In short, Grant's ruthlessness in battle was because he wanted to end the war as quickly as possible. And when he did so, he was magnanimous in caring for those defeated. Now, I haven't talked about Grant's presidency. Grant's presidency takes up about 50% of my biography of Grant. I've tried to stick to the military aspect because that's what I was told to do. Grant left with a distinct military legacy. He changed the way we looked at war. The idea that war was a rational exercise in maneuver was rejected, and we began to concentrate our efforts on destroying the enemy army. Grant ignored cities and rail junctions and supply points, didn't care about occupying enemy territory, but he was relentless in his pursuit of the enemy army, and he was absolutely determined to destroy it. Both Grant and Eisenhower recognized that war is a terrible thing, and after victory, both were determined to prevent it from ever happening again. Now, I can talk endlessly about Grant. Endless is a word that a speaker probably should never use. I remember when I was at the University of Toronto, the Toronto Blue Jays were playing the Boston Braves in the World Series. Boomer Wells, colorful pitcher, was pitching for Toronto, getting shelled unmercifully by the Braves. Cito Gaston went out to relieve him, and Wells told Gaston, "I'm not tired." Gaston looked at him and said, I know, but the outfielders are." Grant's funeral in 1865 was really a fitting testament to national unity. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, accompanied by General John B. Gordon, led 60,000 marchers up Broadway to Riverside Park. 1.5 million people lined the parade route at Grant's funeral. The Stonewall Brigade marched alongside the Grand Army of the Republic. At Grant's request, the pallbearers included an equal number of Confederate and Union generals: Sherman and Sheridan, Johnston and Simon Bolivar Buckner, followed by President Cleveland, ex-President Hayes, and Arthur. Grant was concerned about peace, and the words over Grant's tomb, if you ever look at it, the words facing south, "Let us have peace." I think to look at Grant and to understand Grant, and I would say that for Eisenhower as well, you have to realize that these men had seen total war. These men wanted to avoid it again, and in Grant's case, the fastest way to achieve that was to defeat the Confederate Army totally. Finally, I'll say a word about the picture. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Lincoln. It's a superb movie. My only objection is that they made Grant in the movie look like Winfield Scott instead of Zachary Taylor. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions about Grant or Ike or Roosevelt or Marshall or Clay. Please.
Sir, Tom Daniel, W.P. Davidson High School in Mobile, Alabama. Not so much a question, but just a comment. I was really touched by your remarks about your family history and having a Confederate veteran in your family history, and I was touched by that because I have the same thing in my family. My late dad was a World War II Navy veteran, but on my dad's side of the family, we do have a Confederate veteran on my dad's side of the family, and that's part of my interest in military history. So I really appreciate it, and I was touched by that comment.
Well, it's unusual where you've got 4 or 5 little kids from Chickasaw County up at Shiloh. Gosh, and I guess this would have been 1942, 1943, and your father tells you that, and you know that your great-grandfather has been killed there, and was on the wrong side. Anything additional on Grant? Sir, in the back.
Pete Mansour of the Ohio State University. I love that scene in the Battle of the Wilderness, I think, when Grant's on a log whittling away and messengers are coming up to him saying, Lee's doing this, Lee's doing that, and Grant finally explodes and says, stop telling me what he's going to do to us. let me know what we're going to do to him. And I'm wondering if you know anything more about that particular vignette, and if you could say something about it.
Well, it's a marvelous illustration of the way in which Grant was the calm at the center of the storm. Grant had given the orders. Grant had confidence in the Corps commanders who were doing the job, and there was nothing that Grant could do at that point. It was out of his hands. And rather than attempting to be busy and whatever, he simply waited for this thing for the situation to crystallize, to mature, where he could make another decision. And I think that was typical all the way of Grant throughout the war. Sometimes he became impatient. At Chattanooga, he wanted General Thomas to attack more quickly than Thomas did, but George Thomas. I'm wandering here in answer to your question, but George Thomas was a very large man, about 280, 300 pounds, and he's called the Rock of Chickamauga for good reason. Grant wanted to attack, and Thomas said no, that he couldn't get his artillery out of the park because the mules had all been. Had died, and he had to wait for the mules to be replaced. And Grant kept pressing, and Thomas simply refused. And unfortunately, the mules were replaced. Grant wanted him to use officers' horses to pull the cannon, and Thomas said, "No, that won't work," and simply waited. I might say also that it was there that Grant was almost captured. Grant liked to go off on his own and wander along the front and see what was happening. And Longstreet's corps in the Army of Virginia were dressed in blue, and Grant wandered across the front lines into the Confederate line and talked to a sentry. And the sentry saluted him, and Grant came back. It was incredible. But I think the point of sitting there whittling on a stick, Grant detached himself from the immediate surroundings. That's why he left Halleck in charge in Washington. He didn't want to be bothered. He didn't want to be bothered with those things, and wanted to be able to be there himself and to be able to make the decision singly. I think he'd seen Winfield's. Zachary Taylor do that and really modeled himself on Taylor in that respect. Sir.
Was Grant fortunate to have a good support system behind him, between Rawlins, his own wife, Sherman? You know, was Washburn, was he fortunate to have some of those people behind him?
Well, yes, they were fortunate to have him. Yes, but Grant picked them, really. Sheridan was very junior, and Grant picked Sheridan to command the cavalry there in Northern Virginia. Sherman had wanted to go home at one time, and Grant had kept him from doing so. I think Grant could recognize ability. He relieved Rosecrans and replaced him with Thomas. I think, and look, Colonel Buchanan had forced him out of the Army. Grant recognized that Buchanan was really pretty good and immediately promoted him to Major General and whatever. I think Grant got in trouble later in his presidency because of his friendships. Grant would never desert a friend, and some of his friends probably should have been deserted when he was president, and that really got him into trouble. I didn't speak about Grant's presidency. I wasn't there, but I will. Grant's, when I started to write the book on Grant, my editors, I was Simon & Schuster at the time, looked at my outline and said, Gene, you really need to spend more time on Grant's presidency. And so I did, and almost 50% of the book is on Grant's presidency, and just as with his generalship, his presidency has been terribly underrated. As I said, Grant fought for racial equality in the South. He destroyed the Ku Klux Klan while Grant was president. Almost 3,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan were jailed and arrested in South Carolina and Mississippi and jailed in upstate New York. He destroyed the Klan. More importantly, economically, Grant took the United States back onto the gold standard and ended the inflation that had continued after the Civil War. He made peace. He made peace on the Great Plains. It's really an underrated record, significantly. And I didn't know that until my editor said, "Well, why don't you pursue it and follow it?" And it was very useful to do, and I'm very glad that I did. Sir.
Rob Bucheri, Carmel High School in New York. Just wanted to ask you, what was Grant's thinking before Shiloh? Why was he so surprised at the attack? That seems...
Grant didn't know where Albert Sidney Johnson was, and he didn't realize that he was really just down the road, and they were absolutely surprised that Sunday morning, and it was Grant made mistakes. I mean, Shiloh clearly was a mistake, but he learned from it, I think Cold Harbor was a mistake. In the sense that the amount of loss that he encountered. He made a frontal attack at Vicksburg, and that was a mistake. But he learned from those losses. Eisenhower made mistakes. The landing at Salerno, Kasserine Pass. A successful general learns from his errors and is able to correct them. And doesn't give in. At Shiloh that evening, Sherman wanted to tell Grant that they ought to withdraw and put the Tennessee behind them and the Confederates. Just as Grant was whittling there in the wilderness, at Shiloh, Grant was standing under a tree alone that night in the rain, thinking about what to do, and they attacked the next morning. So I think Grant had fallen so low that he didn't have anything to lose, if that's not just too vulgar a characterization. Thank you. Oh, please.
Dave Sharp from Boone High School. I've always, whenever I study Grant, I always, it comes back to his relationship with Sherman for me a lot of the times. And you didn't mention that a whole lot. I was just wondering if there's anything more you could say with his, relationship with Sherman. This famous quote. They said, "I stood by him when he was drunk, and he stood by me when I was crazy." If you remember that quote. But did he have any kind of relationship like that with the other generals in the Army? Was it special, or am I just misreading it? Or
bear in mind, this is a military chain of command. Even with Sherman, I mean, this is a military chain of command. I mean, they could chat agreeably sometime, but Grant was in charge, and these other people were his subordinates, and that really colored his relationship with virtually everyone. But Grant wore that command and that authority quite easily. He unlike McClellan, if you want an opposite, McClellan was very conscious of his rank. Grant was conscious of it, but it was relaxed. And as I say, I go back to the movie Lincoln. This is an unusual picture of Grant in a uniform. Grant was normally dressed in a private's uniform with simply his rank on his shoulders. He didn't parade that. Yes, sir.
Richard Vandenbosch, Modesto, California. The things you shared were fascinating. To what do you attribute, then, this lack of credit for his accomplishments? Is it simply the scandals that happened during his administration that we choose to overlook the accomplishments? No.
I think I wanted to stress the fact, when Grant died, he was at the peak of his popularity. I mean, the scandals were there, and everyone knew about the scandals. Grant was at the peak of his popularity when he died. It's an enormous outpouring of support for him. It was 3 generations of racial prejudice. It was 3 generations of white supremacy that I think is responsible for trashing Grant's reputation at the hands of lost cause historians from the South, who belittled Grant because Grant, as Frederick Douglass said, was the last of the radicals. Grant believed in racial equality. Don't forget, in the 1876 election between Hayes and Tilton, the Union Army was still in the South. And it was in the saw-off that allowed Hayes to take office without the Democrats really fighting it was when Hayes agreed, or Hayes' supporters agreed, that they would withdraw the Union Army from the South. And once the Union Army was withdrawn from the South, the bourbon aristocracy came back into control. So Grant was identified with Reconstruction. Grant was identified with racial equality. And for 3 generations, Americans just didn't like that. Yes, sir.
Mark Yonaway from Wamogo High School. I've recently been reading a book called Lincoln's Code. And in it, they talk a lot about laws of war, the development of the laws of war, General Order 100, which was published by Lieber during the Lincoln administration, and which Grant would have fallen under. And, you know, your comments about total war and destroying everything in the Shenandoah Valley sort of go against that and go against the actions of Washington. Washington was a great supporter of laws of war. You know, he was very much behind equal, you know, the treatment of soldiers. And, you know, there was a lot of question during the Mexican-American War, during the Civil War, about how should we treat these insurgents, guerrilla fighters, you know, the Redlegs versus the Missouri guerrillas, stuff like that. You know, and this becomes important as we're talking about how we're dealing with insurgents today. And so, you know, my question is, was it appropriate for Grant to give Sheridan the orders he gave, and for Sherman to be receiving those orders? And if it was appropriate, then, of course, we ask the question, would that same sort of approach to insurgency be appropriate today?
Let me dodge the last part of the question. Grant wanted to end the war as quickly as possible. He knew that Lee had a vessel that was rapidly emptying. Food was a problem. Manpower was a problem. Grant ground down the manpower, and he wanted to cut off the food supplies that they had, and he gave Sherman that order, Sheridan the order to destroy what was growing in the valley. I think that's different. But his intent was immediately to put pressure on that army in the field, that Confederate army in the field. I think that's different today. I don't think Grant's actions then just say that the end justifies the means, which I think you approach when you deal with the current situation. I think Grant was limited to things of direct military utility. And it began really on the march from Vicksburg east, after Vicksburg had been captured. They laid waste to Mississippi and Alabama and so forth, and this was very deliberate on their part. But that's different from mistreating prisoners, which Grant never did, torture, or any of the other problems that we have currently. I think that they're different categories.
Well, no, I mean, I think that the U.S. military today would agree that those things are wrong, but we are very restrained in our actions against civilian populations today. We
well, look
go
at World
to
War II.
excessive extremes to avoid civilian casualties, damage to civilian goods. We pay for damaged vehicles. You know, a guy runs over a car with his tank. You know, we pay the owner for the car, that sort of thing.
Of course, that's because that's an isolated example. But look at World War II. Look at the bombing of Germany in World War II. We weren't very concerned about civilian casualties at that point. And Grant never focused on civilian lives. I mean, this was on food and clothing in factories, not lives themselves. World War II, we escalated when we bombed German cities. Sir.
Hi. This is with respect to early on in your talk. You touched on the relative reputations, the military reputations of Lee and Grant, or Lee versus Grant. That's a question that comes up, or it's a debate that comes up in my own military history class with my own students frequently, largely because I think the sequence is they take U.S. history and then they wind up in my military history class. They come to the class with an understanding that Lee was by far the superior commander, and we wind up having some fairly lengthy debates on that. The whole thing was crystallized for me. We had a German foreign exchange student who pointed out, but you always see in the painting, I see Lee surrendering to Grant. So why is it that you all assume that he's such a better general? I was wondering if you had some comment on the mechanism by which that reputation was developed.
Well, I think exactly right. I mean, I think you have to look at the wilderness. Lee had done exactly what he'd done 3 times in the past. He'd attacked the Union Army, and Grant, for the 4th time, and the first time, it didn't bother him. He simply continued those sidle movements to his left and continued the attack. So I think that confrontation at the wilderness, more than anything else, shows the Grant's skill as the superior skill as a general. I don't want to diminish Lee's generalship. Grant is the first Union general who was able to take him on. But he was the first Union general who took him on, and he beat him. Sir, well, please.
Abby Schramm, Pequot Lakes, Minnesota. The way I've always been taught Grant is honest man, poor politician. But my question is, how do you go from a man that is clearly well versed in military and clearly a great military leader to, we're not giving him the credit he deserves, obviously, as president, but what is his political education? What made him suited to even have the position of president if he was a middle-scoring graduate of West Point and he gets this reputation of being a poor politician in American history textbooks? Is he really that poor of a politician? Was he? Because that is the message that my textbooks pass on to my students.
I don't think I ever argued that he was a poor politician.
No, you haven't. You've given me a completely different spin on Grant than what my textbooks teach. So what I want to know is, what is his political education that makes him be a better president than what my textbooks are telling my students he is?
I don't think it's his political education. I think that Grant naturally had good natural judgment. And he was the logical person to be nominated in '68. He didn't seek the nomination, but there was no other contender at that point to replace Johnson, and Grant was lucky also. Now Eisenhower was. I think we sometimes overlook the importance of luck in all of this. If Johnson had been impeached, there would have been an incumbent Republican president, and Grant would not have been president. So Grant was lucky in that respect. Eisenhower was lucky. Tom Dewey lost the election in '48 to Harry Truman. At that point, the Republican nomination in '52 became open. If Dewey had won, he would have been renominated in '56. Eisenhower would have been too old in '60 to run. So luck plays an important role in these things. Any other questions? Thank you very much. Thank you.